um, so that it does not interrupt me.
Yay.
Yay! Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm watching our participant numbers rise. So I'm just going to get us started with our little, I guess we can call it a little author rodeo tonight, just because of one of our guests at the very least. A little teaser for you. But I want to thank all of you, especially our authors, for joining us tonight for our live virtual author showcase. We're here tonight to celebrate Paul Skenazy, Lisa Hendrickson, and Luanne Rod. I'm your host, Jessica, from the Country Bookshelf on the ancestral unceded land of the Apsalaki Crow, Kootenai, Bitterroot Salish, Cheyenne, Shoshone-Bannock, Achedi-Chikoan, Kalispel Pend Oreille, South Piikani, Blackfeet, Northern Cheyenne, Chippewa Cree, Assiniboine, Aani Grovant, and the Dakota peoples, among others. We encourage those of you tuning in from outside Bozeman and Montana to learn more about the land that you occupy and the stories of its peoples. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter on our website to stay up to date on all that is happening at Country Bookshelf as we prepare for the holidays. And follow us on Eventbrite to register for more great upcoming events, including tomorrow's event. We'll be streaming with Laura Kalpakian and about her memoir, or her how-to, actually, that might be of interest to a lot of our writing students, viewers this evening. Her new book is called Memory into Memoir. And of course, we have some amazing Books in Common Northwest events coming up in November, since it is almost that time. Before we get to our authors tonight, we want to point out a few things about our virtual space. You can purchase a copy of any of the authors' books tonight. There is a link in the chat, and that'll casually reappear every so often. So you can add everyone's books to your shopping cart and gift away. We are also recording tonight's event, so that will be streaming on the Country Bookshelf YouTube channel. If you run into tech issues along the way and exiting and re-entering the webinar doesn't work, we do recommend looking for that YouTube stream. It's usually pretty easy to find, Country Bookshelf YouTube search, and you can watch from there. And if you run into any sound issues, headphones will typically fix the problem. But I do want to remind you also that this is a shared creative space, that we want to remain safe for everyone that's joined us. So please be respectful. Offensive or harmful comments or questions will see the user dismissed from the space. And the way tonight's going to go, we are going to meet with each of our three authors, and then there will be time for questions after each author's presentation. You can leave those questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or dropping them in the chat, and we'll get to them as time allows. And we'll probably have a little time at the end for a few more questions if you still have something burning in the back of your mind. But tonight, we are going to kick off with Luanne Rod and her book, Maddie McDowell and the Railroad Robbery. Very alliterative, Luanne. Growing up on a dairy farm in Minnesota, Luanne Rod had three loves: reading, writing, and horses. That hasn't changed, except for the additions of a husband, son, and a daughter-in-law, one big cat, and 4 crazy dogs. Her reading list tend towards titles with plucky heroines and heroes, adventure with a generous dollop of humor, and a heartfelt friendship, both animal and human. Now living in Montana under the great big sky, she enjoys riding her Arabian horses across prairies and mountains, playing with her dogs, and sharing her stories with young readers and kindred dreamers. Luanne earned her bachelor's degree in English literature through Montana State University, go Bobcats, and worked 25 years in the newsroom at her local newspaper. So without further ado, Luanne, take it away.
Thank you. I'm Luanne Rod, and Maddie McDowell and the Rodeo Robbery is my debut novel, an historical adventure for middle grade readers, published through a Montana publishing house, Chicken Scratch Books. And I'm proud to say just nominated for a Western Writers of America Spur Award in the Young Readers category. So this isn't an adult title, but it is a I hope it's something that adult gatekeepers will enjoy reading as they look at it for their young readers that they have in their household. It's pretty common for parents, teachers, librarians to be the gatekeepers for their young readers. And so I hope they enjoy it just as much as the kids do. And thank you, Country Bookshelf, for inviting me and letting me tell you about my book tonight. I've lived in the Gallatin Valley now for a long time, coming originally from Minnesota. The West has always been a dream for me since I was a kid, being a horse person. I always dreamed about riding across the prairies and through the mountains. And since we moved here in, I think, 1976, I've had the opportunity to do quite a lot of that. So for me, this is sort of a very natural place to set any book, and the history of the West has always been pretty interesting to me. I first got interested in early cowgirls and rodeo through an article I did for the Bozeman Daily Chronicle several years ago. And it was about the first Bozeman Roundup, which was held in 1919. And that is the era that my book is set in. It's set in a fictional town, but there are a few recognizable locales that are peppered throughout the book. And it's largely Madison County, Gallatin County, though they aren't really named. My hero, Maddie, started with a conversation that I had with a neighbor. I would go riding up on my neighbor's ranch, and I would stop and visit Myrtle because she loved seeing the horses and talking about growing up on a ranch in Montana. And so she would tell me some pretty funny stories about being a kid. And she told me a story about being about 9 or 10 years old. And she went with her parents into town to go to a rodeo. And she saw cowgirls for the first time. This would have probably been back in about 1930, in the 1930s sometime. And she was so impressed that when she came home, she ran upstairs, packed a suitcase, came down. Mother met her at the bottom of the stairs and said, "Where do you think you're going, young lady?" And she said, "Well, I'm going to join the rodeo." Well, that plucky girl just stuck in my head. And that was the beginning of Maddie, a 12-year-old, almost 13 Montana ranch girl who runs away to join the rodeo. I hope that I was able to imbue her with a huge amount of courage and independence and heart. So the story starts with Maddie having been sent to boarding school against her will. She hates everything about it. The teachers, the head schoolmistress, her fellow students, but most of all, her lack of freedom. And she just can't take it. The Monte Decker Rodeo is about to get on the train and head out of town, and she is bound and determined to be on it. But of course, being adventures, things don't really go very smoothly. She's chased by the butcher's dog next door, who decides to go along with her. And then she gets mistaken for a rodeo star who is extremely skillful and looks just like Maddie. And of course, with the wisdom of a 12-year-old, she decides it's a good idea to just go with it. The orphans fund is missing. And for good measure, it seems like someone is out to hurt Maddie, or is that person out to hurt the girl that she's impersonating? Joining forces with new friends, Maddie is determined to solve the mysteries she uncovers, and at the same time prove to Monte Decker that she's as good a rodeo rider as the cowgirl extraordinaire that she's purporting to be. And at the heart of it all, through the adventure and humor, Maddie is aching from the death of her mother and searching for a new family to replace the family that she feels has betrayed her. Yep, as Maddie would say, she's in deeper than a yearling calf in a sinkhole. So my publisher is Chicken Scratch Books, which is out of Wisdom, Montana. The publisher senior editor is Carrie Jorgensen, who was a longtime educator here in the state, both in Bozeman and other schools. And what she does is unique to the publishing world. She, besides publishing original middle grade novels, she develops a comprehensive novel study course to go with each book. And this is for homeschoolers, for small schools, for anyone who wants to help their students develop critical reading of literature. And that's available through chickenscratchbooks.com. And I think that about covers it.
Excellent, Luanne. Thank you. Folks, as a reminder, you can leave questions in the chat or by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen at any time. But I might start, Luanne, as a horse person and researching the character of Maddie McDowell. Did you do any rodeo riding, either in your younger years or...
No, I have ridden since I was around 12. I did horse showing at that time, but I stay away from bucking horses, and I still ride. I do long distance riding now. So, but no, bucking horse is not something that I'm interested in. However, doing the research on the early cowgirls, there's some material out, but there's not lots and lots of it. But some of it is very interesting, and there's some pretty vivid examples of what cowgirls and cowboys go through when they ride a bucking horse. So yeah, there's a lot of imagination there, and I'm sure I didn't hurt as bad riding it as they hurt when they go off.
That's a fact. There's a lot of other interesting historical tidbits in Maddie McDowell. One of the ones that you mentioned is that Orphans Fund. And of course, everyone loves a heist novel. So I'm curious, is there something that you uncovered in your research that didn't make it into the rodeo robbery that we might find in Maddie's next adventure, or that you just had to leave completely on the cutting room floor?
I have some ideas. One of the characters, well, there's a couple of characters which I would really truly love to expand on. One of the characters is Rose, the Salish girl, who I would love to make a bigger part of a future adventure, and to explore a little bit more of the Native American community at that time. Yeah.
Fantastic. Wonderful. I'm just going to do a double check on our chat and our Q&A. Well, I think we'll probably have some more questions, Luanne, once we've heard from Lisa, who has her own perspective on some wild women of Montana. But we are going to sandwich our good friend Paul here in between. Paul Skenazy grew up in Chicago and studied at the University of Chicago and Stanford University. He taught literature and writing for 35 years at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His nonfiction works include a book on James M. Cain, excuse me, a collection of essays on place in San Francisco literature, and a selection of interviews with Maxine Hong Kingston. He has published more than 300 reviews of fiction and nonfiction for newspapers and magazines nationwide, and has been twice nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award for reviewing. For a dozen years, he was a mystery review columnist for the Washington Post. His short novel, Temper, California, came out in 2019, and you might remember him from his visit to us in that year, in those halcyon days, pre-pandemic. Temper, California won the Miami University Press Novella Contest. His stories and essays have recently appeared in Catamaran Literary, Reader, Chicago Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. He is beaming to us tonight from Santa Cruz, California, where he lives with his wife and the poet Farnaz Fatemi.
Thank you. Thanks, Jessica. Thanks so much for having me. And I want to thank Country Bookshelf for sponsoring this event and for letting me in. I'm not exactly a local writer, but my son lives in Bozeman, and I spend a lot of time there. And like him, I've fallen in love with Bozeman and Montana over the last 6 years that I've had a chance to visit. As Jessica noted, in 2019, I got a chance to read at the Country Bookshelf itself, the real store, and that was a great treat. The reading took place in June, and it was the first time that my then 3-year-old granddaughter was able to see an actual book reading and visited. It also took place on the solstice in June, and we had a snowstorm. So, which is not something I could say about California in the middle of June. It was a great treat and something I will never forget, and has become part of the kind of legacy of being a writer for me. I'm going to talk tonight about my new novel, which is called Still Life, and I'm just going to brag about it for just a second that way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the book first, and then talk a little bit about where it came from and a little bit of the background of it. Still Life is, in some ways, a very different kind of book than Luanne was describing, but it too involves the death of someone at the heart of it. It's the story of a year in a man's life. To say this another way, it's a story of art, grief, and rocks. The main character, Will Moran, is a high school teacher for decades, and then his wife, Edie, gets cancer. So he retires from teaching to care for him, and then faces the death of her. The book begins right after she's died, when Will is trying to figure out what he's going to do with himself for the rest of his life. What he does is he suddenly stops being who he was. He turns away from his friends, his family, and his familiar habits. He gives away his furniture. He sits on his roof, gazing out across the town where he lives. He starts writing down his fitful thoughts in a notebook. Unable to sleep, he starts walking the streets at night, going down to the beaches, picking up rocks and carrying them home in his backpack. One day, he picks up a paintbrush and tries to draw a still life of some of his rocks. He's never painted before. He's never been interested in art before. But suddenly, he becomes obsessed. So he tries again the next day and the next, first on paper, then on canvas, then on the walls of his house. His night walks grow longer and longer. He looks at people through their lit windows and searches through their garbage. And he writes. He writes about his sadness, his memories, and his painting. He keeps wondering why Edie died, why he suddenly cares so much about things like boundary, shape and color, light and shadow. Meantime, the world doesn't leave Will alone with his sorrow. His wife's closest friend and her grandson barge in on him. He realizes a former student has been following him on his walks, and that unwanted connection leads him to a confrontation with an abusive husband. These and other unexpected intruders invade Will's solitude. They never let him rest, and they force him to finally to confront the person he once was and the man he has become. As I said, Still Life is about art, grief, and rocks, and how looking hard at one thing, even a rock, can help one rediscover life and its astonishing possibilities. The idea for the novel came to me years ago when I first saw an art exhibit of a painter named Giorgio Morandi. And here I'm going to get myself off screen for just a moment, hopefully with some success. These are some of Morandi's paintings. Let me see if I can figure that out. There we go. Just to give you a sense of the kind of work he does, he paints still lifes. He has a collection of not rocks, but of urns and vases and bottles and a few cans that he puts together in various configurations again and again and again, painting them in a various series of pastels. I'm going to show you one more painting if I can. One more series of paintings. These are some of the watercolors that he comes to very late in his life. But I saw an exhibit of his in the early 1980s, years and years ago, but became obsessed with his work on my own time. And I just became interested in this idea of what might happen to someone who painted one subject again and again and again, and who that person might be, where he came from, what he might think about. And that's really what led me to this novel. It's a story of a man trying to come to terms with the past, trying to come to terms with the present, trying to imagine that he has a future. But it's also the story of someone who just picks up a paintbrush randomly and then has it take over his life and really become the kind of center of his life. So I don't think of it as a book about art, and I don't think of it as a book about grief or loss, but really about recovery and how you can turn yourself into something that you've never imagined you were by immersion. That's really all I have to say for now. I just wanted to give you a sense of the book and what it's about and what might be available for you inside of it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. I'm curious if, so your wife is a poet.
Yes.
Do you share things with them prior to publication, and do you try to have that kind of painterly style as you're writing, that poetry style as you're writing? Because I know, of course, not only is Still Life different from Luanne's title, but it's also very different from Temper, California.
Oh, very. Yeah.
And so what is it like to kind of play with those two different forms?
Well, first, I wish I were a poet. And I wish I had her skill with single words and with lines. We do read and exchange work, but we wait quite a while into the process. I give her things when I pretend they're finished. They're never finished, but I pretend. And at that point she says, no, there's work to be done. And she's great at catching those things and moving me forward. She does the same with me, so that I'll see her work after she's gone through several revisions of it. She's just about to actually publish a book of poetry herself. And so we've been going through a couple of poems, but most of them she works on her own. In terms of writing, I guess the first thing I should say is I'm a terrible painter, terrible artist. And part of what was interesting about this book was both learning about art and also thinking about what it is to be a beginner and to try to come to terms with one's ineptitudes at some level. I don't think of the writing as painterly, but this is a poetic book, and the first book, Temper CA, was more of an adventure story, and it bounced around and moved pretty quickly from scene to scene. Here, part of what I was trying to do was just dwell on a scene for a while. And I guess in that sense, it's like Will painting because he's staring and staring. And one of the things you get to do as a writer is look at something longer. Or one of the things I enjoy about being a writer is you get to look at things longer than you normally would, rushing by them in your life. So it gave me there's a number of scenes which are seemingly fairly static, in which he's standing in a room, for example, staring at a painting and trying to describe it, or he's having a conversation with someone. But I don't think of them as static. I think of them as pushing the plot forward and pushing his mind forward and letting us into things that would not be available otherwise.
Wonderful. One of our viewers would like to know, are you yourself prone to obsessions besides the one about the artist that you mentioned?
Yes. But I think I should probably ask other people to describe what mine are. I do collect things. I have a collection of pens. I have some fetishes from New Mexico, things like that. I suppose, the lifelong obsession is with writing. I taught it. And then when I retired, I had to, in some odd way, relearn it, because teaching it is very different. Teaching it and writing for the academic audience is very different from writing a novel. And I'd always dreamed of writing a novel. So these are obsessions that have kept me going pretty much all my life. And then I suppose my dog is right now, he's chewing on a bone quietly.
Yes.
But yes.
One of the things that I really appreciate about Still Life is that sense of what it's like to be a beginner later in life. And that life reinvention that you mentioned you experienced, and also that Tom goes through over the course of the book. So I'm curious how being like trying new things and reinventing yourself as Paul also influenced how Tom reinvents himself through this grief journey.
Yeah, in kind of different ways. I mean, when I retired, I did start taking courses. I'd always taken courses in yoga, for example, and in Pilates and things of that sort. I learned to swim in my 30s, and I'd really never been able to swim before. I took art classes after I retired. I took piano lessons after I retired. So I've dipped into that, and it's nice that you mention it, because I do think there's a way in which we can recharge our engine that way, by going into new material and new discoveries. I think the other side of that is that while I was writing this, my mother and father both died. And so, and a very dear friend of my wife's and mine. I had already written much about the grief in the book, but that changed my perspective on it. So these things happen to you, and they, if you're really lucky, you have enough of finger on the pulse that you can let them in. And I think the book is better for them.
Absolutely. Tom, ironically, reminded me a lot of my father after my mom died. My dad's name is also Tom, so that helped. But he spent a lot of time making the urn that contains her, and like that was his sort of artistic get it all out kind of process. So
that's great. I'm really glad that it did evoke your father for you.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us and sharing Still Life with us.
Thank you.
We will have more time for questions here in a little bit, but I want to make sure that we can chat with Lisa. Lisa Hendrickson is the owner of Lisa Hendrickson Communications and a former corporate and nonprofit public relations director. She has written or edited 5 books, including Indiana at 200, A Celebration of the Hoosier State, and Curatesis and Me, Enduring 63 Hours at Gunpoint. Lisa is here to share with us Burning the Breeze, which is new this fall. Lisa,
thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you. So Burning the Breeze is a nonfiction book. And it was inspired by many trips to Montana. Like Paul, I am not a Montana native, but my brother lived in Montana for 20 years. And so I have spent a lot of time there learning about the state and its history, and just becoming fascinated with the Western landscape. I'm a Midwestern girl. And my book, Burning the Breeze, 3 Generations of Women in the American West, which is published by University of Nebraska Press, it was inspired, I have always had a love of strong women, stories about strong women, and stories about historical moments that people don't know about. So Burning the Breeze is, as the title suggests, it's about 3 generations of Montana women. And the main character, again, true story, is Julia Bennett, who was the first woman to own and operate independently a dude ranch in Montana, the Diamond J, which still exists. It's near Ennis. And it's actually run today by the family that bought it from her in the 1950s. So Julia, in 1931, in the middle of the Great Depression, she was a single mom with 2 children, and she had to find a way to earn money. So she went to New York to try to find guests for this brand new dude ranch, which she had financed with the help of some local businessmen. She was also known as a big game hunter. She was called in a newspaper article a clever shot with both rifle and shotgun. And she had been taught how to hunt by her father, Benjamin Franklin Bembrick, who came from Missouri to first he went to Colorado, and then he went to the Montana Territory as a buffalo hunter and started a cattle ranch there, one of the first cattle ranchers in the Jefferson Valley in the Montana Territory. I found out about Julia through my brother, whose friend, Sherry Pepper, who I believe might be listening in with us today, said, I want somebody to write about my grandmother. And I said to my brother, what did your grandmother do? And he said her grandmother was the first woman to own and operate a dude ranch in Montana. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. Unbeknownst to my brother, I had been looking for a writing project. And this sounded so intriguing. And so I thought, I don't really know if there's enough information about this to make a book, maybe a magazine article, maybe something like that. But when I started researching, and I discovered that the Diamond J still operates, and that Sherry had loads of family memorabilia, including family photo albums from the 1860s, scrapbooks. Julia Bennett saved all of her guest books from the Dude Ranch. And she ended up being quite a successful dude ranch owner just through her pluck and spirit. She attracted famous artists, including William Henry Jackson, who was the first person to photograph Yellowstone. She lured him to the Diamond J and took him to the Livingston Rodeo, which he found quite interesting, being I don't think he'd ever been to the Livingston Rodeo before. And he wrote about all of this in his diaries, which are in the New York Public Library. So I found all of his diary entries about Mrs. Bennett, including what she wore and where she took him when he was visiting the Diamond J. Then the story also is about Julia's mother and grandmother, who came to the Montana Territory in the 1860s. They were fleeing the Civil War in Missouri, and they took a wagon train out to the Montana Territory. They landed in Virginia City. And then Julia's grandmother was a widow, very young widow, with her 7-year-old daughter, and she had to repay the family's debts after her husband died. So she had to make a living as a seamstress and find a way to repay those debts back in Missouri. I was fortunate enough to be able to find still in a courthouse in Missouri, all of the records from her husband's death, including all of the bills she owed, how much money, how she paid them back. And then in the Montana Historical Society, I found excerpts of her 1867 diary, which she wrote when she and her daughter went from San Francisco back to the Montana Territory after they had spent a year there while she was trying to earn enough money, again, to pay off those debts. And it was a month-long trip via stagecoach and lots of other things, and lots of other conveyances. And just reading about the trials these women underwent and succeeded and managed to make a living and make a home in first the Montana Territory and then Montana. And then finally, Julia was so successful that she needed to find a place to have a ranch during the winter months, because obviously nobody wants to come to a dude ranch in Montana, or not very many people, in the middle of winter. So she started the Diamond W Ranch in Tucson. And that was a ranch that originally was owned by the Westinghouse family. And she ran both ranches for about 20 years. And so the story of these three women, when I discovered all of these papers, I discovered it was not just the story of Julia, but it was the story of these three women who were intrepid and adventurous and just did what they had to do in order to survive, and did it successfully. And we've heard a lot of stories about men in the West, but I think it's about time that we hear about what some of these women did as well. And I think their story is compelling and can teach us a lot about pluck and the adventurous spirit.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you that may have just joined us or joined us late, you can leave questions for any of our authors at any time. Just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or drop them in the chat. I'm curious, Lisa, one of my favorite questions that I ask most nonfiction writers is what got left on the cutting room floor? Because obviously you can't fit every detail of an entire life into the story, but some of those are often the juicy bits.
Yeah.
that are
I put in all the juicy bits. No, there was a lot of material, and this was a project that took me almost 10 years. I did a lot of research online. Fortunately, all of the newspapers that I needed are now online. And so I was able to actually search by family name and find all the daily details of their life. So I had to cull a lot of that information and think, for the average reader, and I didn't want this to be an academic history. I wanted it to be, to read like fiction. And so what I was aiming to do was find these moments in their lives that really told the story of who they were and how they managed to make it. One thing I neglected to say is the country bookshelf was a great resource for me. And every time I come to Montana, I go to the country bookshelf, and I found my bookshelf is full of your books that I used for research. So you really were an important part of this project as well.
Always happy to help. Wonderful. We've got a question. Is was it the Diamond J or the Diamond W in Arizona? Is the Diamond W in Arizona still operating?
The Dude Ranch in Tucson. The Dude Ranch in Tucson is the Diamond W, and the Dude Ranch in Montana is the Diamond J.
Okay.
The Diamond W also still exists. It's now a rehabilitation center, but the Westinghouse family home is still there, and it's a beautiful building that was built by a famous Tucson architect. And so although you can't visit it, I was able to take a trip there and get a sense of what it was like when Julia ran it.
Does that mean that you also got to spend some time at the Diamond J? And what were some of your favorite experiences on the Dude Ranch?
Well, the Diamond J looks much the same as it did when Julia ran it, because Julia always wanted but she knew that she was attracting wealthy people from the East Coast who expected the best. So she didn't scrimp, and she bought expensive, durable furniture in North Carolina. She bought her china in Chicago, and all of those things you can still find at the Diamond J. Even some of her hunting bear skins and things are still there. So, and it's set in a beautiful valley outside Ennis. She used to take her guests riding up into the Spanish Peaks. So I really was able to get a sense of what it was like when she ran the place for 20 years.
Fantastic. We do have a little bit more time if anyone has questions for Paul or Luanne as well, or if you guys have questions for each other. Luanne and Lisa, are we going to see some of these dude ranches in future adventures of Maddie?
That I find the Dude Ranch, especially the early Dude Ranches, were really, really interesting. And of course, this area was one of the places where some of the first ones came. I read a few books that dealt with early Montana dude ranches, and of course they always inform your character, anything that comes from that time. So I am intrigued by how you mentioned the East Coast and the wealthy that really came to the dude ranches as well. That combination of the Westerner and the Easterner has always been an interesting partnership to me.
Luanne, I
For
can't
sure.
wait to read your book. I want to read all about the Rodeo Girls, because that's a fascinating subject to me as well.
Yes.
They are very fascinating. Some of the nation's first professional women athletes were cowgirls.
Fantastic. Paul, you are muted.
Of course I am. It's easier to talk. I apologize. I had a question for both Luanne and Lisa. I have a really hard time working in historical ways, setting historical scenes, and I tend to stay with the contemporary in that reason. And I can jump back in time for a moment, but I'm curious how you both have nurtured your historical imagination. And because obviously both of you have immersed yourself into these moments of history, and as you say, are reaching for a fictional representation of them with that energy and excitement. So, I mean, I'm just curious how you've worked on that, either one of you or both.
I'll let Luanne go first, since yours is fiction. I'd be interested to hear what you say about that.
I had an editor once tell me that I had too much imagination, and for me, when Maddie started to gel in my head as to who she was and what her voice was, it just, all those years of watching old movies, of, reading stories about the period and going to the nonfiction books and all of that, they just came out naturally in her voice. And from her voice, I felt like building the atmosphere really came from Maddie's voice more than anything, I think.
Great.
Yeah. I think for me, I have to see the place. I have to visit it. And it was hard for me at the beginning because I didn't know exactly where the ranch where Julia grew up was in the Jefferson Valley. And fortunately, I had written an article about Julia for a magazine, and my email happened to be in it. And I was contacted by a man who said, I grew up there. These people are my relatives. I'd never met him. And he said, I'd like to, when you come to Montana, I said, can you show me around this area and show me where the ranch was? And so that's when I got to go visit Toston and Townsend, and just seeing it and then melding that information with what I read in the newspapers really just created an image in my head of what it must have looked like and felt like. And I think it's so important to find out about the food and the smells and all of those things to help the reader feel like they're there.
Right.
I feel like learning about food is always important.
You mentioned the newspapers. The way the newspapers were written at the time, I think, really informs you as to language and how the language feels as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you both. Appreciate it.
I think all of you actually have been involved in newspaper and magazine writing. So I'm curious how your process is altered when writing longer. And if you still feel some of that, like just the facts kind of impulse as you're creating the world and doing that world building?
Well, for me, at the Chronicle, I did some columns and I did mostly feature writing, and then I did some editing and that sort of thing. So for me, whenever I had a feature or a column, it was just about telling the story. And whether it's short or long, it's still about telling the story. And so in that way, it's not that, and it doesn't feel like that big of a stretch, because I wasn't on the government beat or, anything like that. So for me, all my writing over the years has really been about telling a story.
For me, mine was sort of the opposite. I was writing opinions and doing book reviews. On the one hand, it gave me a great education because I got to continually read new material. And it helped me see how a lot of other writers were doing it and see them in a different way than my teaching did, because I wasn't trying to explain a particular book by a classic writer, but trying to come to terms with it myself. And then my job was to tell an audience whether they should read this or not. So on the one hand, partly I had to get rid of that because I don't think my opinion doesn't really matter. The characters' opinions matter in my novels and not mine. On the other hand, it taught me a lot about concision. It did, and it helped me focus, writing 250 to 500 word pieces, and writing them pretty regularly kept me on a disciplined process. I think the thing with a novel, like Luanne said, for me is often the voice, or getting a feel for a character and then moving with her or him through the process of discovery as she or he goes through it in their experiences. So that was something I really just had to learn that was very different. It wasn't my voice anymore. It was a voice that I had to adopt in the context of telling someone else's story. But once I got that voice, then that let me go in a much longer arc than the newspaper did.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
That's interesting. I did start out as a journalist. I started out as a radio and TV journalist, and where I had to be very short and concise. And my writing is still short and concise. I mean, when I look at my book, it has short chapters, and I kind of still have that journalistic style, and actually thought I wasn't sure if I could actually write an entire book, but there were so many interesting things that I learned that for me, it's almost like writing a series of short stories, with each chapter being a different scene, and but very much like Luanne said, telling a story.
Wonderful. Thank you. Leslie says, for Lisa, did any Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Morgans, or other celebrities of the time visit the ranch in Montana?
Well, there were quite a few New York debutantes. There were quite a few wealthy people. In fact, Julia's daughter marries the son of a very wealthy family from New Jersey. And I learned about a lot of cowboy, wealthy West Coast or wealthy East Coast women romances. That was apparently a thing back then. But yes, Julia did. She actually, when she went to New York, she set up a display. She was quite a marketer, and she set up a display in a window on Madison Avenue at the Northern Pacific office, and with spurs and saddles, and people would gather around that window, and she would stand and listen to what they were saying. And there just seemed to be this romance for the West back in the 1920s. It was, and that's how she managed to attract people to her dude ranch.
Fantastic. Well, let's see here. I'm just going to do a quick double check for any more questions. And of course, there are links in the chat to buy everyone's book, because they will make wonderful gifts as we enter the holiday season. I want to thank all of our authors so much for joining us tonight and sharing your books with us. We hope that sometime we can see you in person, and hear more of the stories that you have to tell. And I hope that you viewers will join us tomorrow or next week for more great events with Country Bookshelf and our Books in Common Northwest speaker series. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Luanne.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks
you for making this so easy.
Happy to. Well, that's all she wrote for now. Have a great night, everyone.
You too.
Good night.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night.